to moderate a conversation today with two people that I consider close friends of mine. On the left is Lieutenant McCarthy from the City of Poughkeepsie Police Department, and on the right is Chief of Staff for the City of Pittsburgh Police Department, Commander Eric Holmes. What I like about this format is that we are, in fact, guiding a conversation today. This obviously you can argue it's a presentation, but when we deliver this procedural justice as a training, we open it up with, this is a conversation. We're facilitating and guiding a conversation. We're not here to teach anything or talk to the audience. So this format really works. With that said, you're part of the conversation, everyone in this room. And as any good instructor, you want to know your audience. We were told in the very beginning of this symposium that this room is for the 101 track. So maybe agencies that have not been exposed to certain strategies, something similar to procedural justice. So by a show of hands, who is not familiar with this term in general? Okay, maybe you're being shy. For those that were at the probation officer conference, you know that I called on someone and asked them to explain it, so maybe that's why you're not answering. Just real quick, a Cliff Notes version, because I don't want to mistake this with a training. It's much more different. It's much more than just a training. It really is. It should be a strategy in your police agency. So just real briefly, Cliff Notes version, give a rundown of what procedural justice is. Lieutenant McCarthy.
Cliff Notes version, basically it's the procedures used by police departments basically to increase their legitimacy and in order to build a better relationship with the community in general. So it's basically a mindset, if you will, rather than a specific thing. It's a concept, let's say, rather than here's procedural justice, here's what it is. It's a concept, it's a way of treating people, it's a way of doing things in a different way than maybe we've done them before. My assumption is most of your agencies out there probably do a lot of this stuff without even having a name put to it yet. So it'll kind of give a name to what you're doing.
So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I think it's important just to give a historical approach of how we got here, especially with DCJS hosting this symposium. So a few years back, Department of Justice funded this program to be trained across the country. There was 4 core trainers, 2 in Chicago and 2 in California. We are blessed to have one of those trainers here in the room today. If you could stand up. This is retired Captain Scott Metters from the Stockton Police Department. So he was one of the 4 core trainers that traveled the country to deliver this. And he delivered it to gentlemen like myself and Lieutenant McCarthy. And I have to recognize a few other people in the room who are master trainers in procedural justice. So these are the people that are on contract with DCJS, that have the support behind with DCJS, and travel the state to deliver this to your agencies and personnel. So in the room we have Sergeant Jim Lawyer from Utica Police Department, if you could stand up. Lieutenant Paul Antonovich from Schenectady Police Department. From CUNY we have a trainer, if you could stand up. And I believe that's all in the room. If I missed you, I apologize. So Department of Justice cut the funding, and DCJS said, you know what, this is too important. We got to keep it going. So they supported it. They identified a half dozen trainers that currently travel the state. And I encourage you as administrators, please send your personnel. This is just the beginning. And by the end of the conversation, I think you'll understand what I mean by that. Just attending a training or sending someone to a training is not going to get you to get that police legitimacy, right? So like Lieutenant McCarthy said, procedural justice is the vehicle to attain your police legitimacy. And there's an internal and an external component. These are our objectives today. If they look similar, they are. Out of the 49 presentations, obviously I didn't attend them all, but you keep hearing this recurring theme. And we heard it within the luncheon remarks made a few moments ago, right? So the first one, it's a difficult one. It's a courageous conversation that you have to have, but we have to talk about the history that law enforcement played in our nation. We're obviously going to talk about 21st century policing principles. We're going to highlight those initiatives, right? So these are the objectives, the bulleted points. But what I really want you to get away from this presentation and this discussion is take something back to your agencies. There's got to be something that we talk about, a program, an initiative, a strategy that you could say, this will work. And what I like about this panel is that you have someone from a small agency of 25 people, sworn members. You have an agency, City of Poughkeepsie, of over 100 officers, and then a City of Pittsburgh, nearly 1,000 sworn officers. So there's no excuse why anyone in this room can't take something back, because all three of our agencies are doing this. And I would argue doing it very well. You know, if I was to ask administrators in the room, police administrators, I have an answer for you. I have a program, I have a strategy that will increase morale, that will build community relations, that will enhance community relations and lend towards trust and legitimacy. And, it's going to reduce crime. And by the way, it doesn't cost you anything. What would you say? You could yell it out. You're full of it? There's no way? This has nothing to do with resources and money. As a chief executive, I'm telling you, there's no budgeted line for procedural justice. There's nothing. There's nothing to gain police legitimacy. It's really a culture that you build. A training is a part of it. So I don't want to make this synonymous. Well, if we attend the training, then we're in a good position. And I think by the end of the conversation, we'll understand that. So 21st century policing, this report came out a few years ago under President Barack Obama. 59 recommendations, 37 apply to municipalities. So municipal local agencies. I encourage you not to just do checkbox. All right, let's do recommendation 1. Let's follow the action plan and the recommendations. And let's try to hit all 37. Because you could attain that, but if you haven't built a culture surrounding these ideas and these principles, I don't think you're going to be as successful. And what is success? It's just like we heard in the remarks at lunch. It's trying to acknowledge those past harms and increase that police legitimacy in our communities and that they trust what we're doing. So something else we have to talk about is the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. The city of Pittsburgh was one of 6 agencies designated for this initiative. And at this time, I'm going to ask Commander Holmes to give a brief overview of what the NI was, how many years it took place, some of the things that did in fact take place, and then last but not least, what can the audience members take away from that work?
Thanks. So the National Initiative started in September of 2014. $4.75 million Department of Justice grant. Brought together the 6 cities that you see on the board there. It included work from the Urban Institute, the Center for Police and Equity, under the direction of Dr. Phil Goff, the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School, and it was coordinated out of John Jay College down in New York. And so it brought us 6 cities together with the goal, the underlying premise is just to build trust between the police and the community. And so we've been doing that work since then. The money for the program ran out earlier this year, but as Chief alluded, the work still continues. Actually, I was just in Stockton again last week with a group of individuals from Pittsburgh talking about the National Initiative and some of the work that we did the past 3 years. 3 pillars under National Initiative: procedural justice, what we talked about earlier, implicit bias, and reconciliation. And so for us, for Pittsburgh, we were able to really bridge the gap between the police and the community, building that trust, because we know that relationships are built at the speed of trust. If you don't have trust, you don't have a positive relationship. And so the National Initiative and the academics that came with it and the sharing of ideas through peer exchanges with the 6 sites really helped us build trust. It included internal climate surveys, external climate surveys, so we had some ways to engage. But if you go to www.trustandjustice.org, it'll lay out the entire process as well as the work within the 6 cities.
Excellent. So what are some things that, because this is for best practices, right? This was a roadmap for police departments across the country. Look at what these 6 sites are doing, proven, demonstrated successes, where they worked with John Jay for the course of 3 years. They did a number of peer exchanges. I know we're not listed on this of the one of 6 agencies, but I was like the redheaded stepchild, and they carried me along, and I did some peer exchanges. So I know the good work that you're doing and that you did do. What's something that they could take away from that report, that study from those 6 cities? Because a lot of those, they're bigger agencies that don't exist here in the state of New York, especially upstate.
I think when we talk about the community bank, and we're going to go into that in a little bit further detail, because we've done a lot of deposits under the National Initiative, but we had extraordinary withdrawal with one incident. All that work culminated in one bad incident, and it was a group of officers who responded to a burglary in progress early in the morning. They happened to be close to the residence that was being burglarized. The homeowner was on the phone with the 911 dispatcher. They get there, the homeowner is shooting at the burglar. The police officers return fire. They don't kill the burglar, they kill the homeowner. And it actually wasn't a burglar. It was the boyfriend of the daughter who she invited over, but the parents didn't know. Parents thought it was an intruder. And we thought, oh my goodness, we're going to take a large withdrawal from the community bank based on their concept under a national initiative. We brought the family in within 12 hours of the incident, explained to them what happened. Of course, they grieve, don't like what happened, but they understood. And I think that there showed, we were ready for protest, ready for negative actions to take place, and that didn't occur.
And it didn't occur because of the trust that you had already built, the transparency and the communication.
Correct. All tenets of the national initiative.
So, like the commander just said, there was 3 areas highlighted. The first is procedural justice, okay? This is something that DCGS has gotten behind, supported across this state. There's 2 components to this, though, right? There's the training component to teach police officers how to engage the public on the street. But there's another component to this, and that's the internal piece. Because if you're not procedurally just as a chief executive, as a senior manager, as a first-line supervisor, as an FTO, as an academy instructor, this is not going to be successful on the street, right? Because you're asking people to treat others in a certain fashion when you are, in fact, not treating them the same way. So I asked Lieutenant McCarthy, what's the importance of internal procedural justice?
So, for my opinion, internal is as important, if not even at times more important than the external procedural justice. The reason for that is it's got to start from the top down, and it has to be every member of your command staff buying in. It has to be every supervisor, every sergeant, lieutenant. They all have to buy in because, again, just like we were talking about the community bank account, one who doesn't is the bad apple who could create an issue. If your officers feel like they are not respected by their supervisors, by their command staff, and then they're supposed to go out and be respectful on the street to people, it just doesn't correlate. So take an example, you have attaboys hung up in the station somewhere, great, right? It looks good, it's procedurally just, the guys are seeing that they're doing good work out there. And then, maybe you have somebody, commander or sergeant, somebody come by and tell the guy who's standing there reading his own attaboy, don't get a big head about it, it's not that big a deal, move along. You know what I mean? And now how's that guy, now when he gets back in the car, is he going to be looking to actually do the right thing when he gets out there, or is he going to say, well, nobody clearly cares that I'm out there doing it right, and you're going to get a whole different animal when you get out there.
So we saw a great example, and I know, Doctor, I apologize, I don't know your last name, the Dayton study. I see you in the audience. But yesterday he talked about, including the commander wanted to push out foot patrols, but they wanted to include the officers and get their opinion and their feedback. So when safety is not at risk, when there's no sense of urgency, and we're trying to plan initiatives and programs and strategies, this is part of it, right? And you don't hit a certain number and say, okay, well, we were procedurally just this month 5 times. It should be in every single conversation, every encounter, every meeting. You should really follow those principles internally, and you're going to get that buy-in when you ask them to do that externally.
And just quickly, it's not easy for those of us who've been around a long time, who believe in the command structure, who this is how it is. You do it because I said so, I'm the lieutenant. It really takes changing a mindset of your administrators, of your commanders.
So thank you. The second pillar mentioned by the commander was implicit bias, right? This is a lot of work that's gone into law enforcement probably over the past 10 years. The problem is, and many of you may agree with me, over that course of 10 years, police agencies went out and found subject matter experts, and I'll use that term loosely, private companies, private vendors that were there for profit and came into police agencies, and they facilitated and delivered implicit bias instruction. And I asked Lieutenant McCarthy just your opinion and your experience, because I know sometimes as soon as you say these 2 words together, police officers, people in law enforcement begin to cringe because of their bad experiences with how it was delivered in the past.
Yeah, so I think part of the problem is that a lot of these outside trainers came in and made implicit bias 100% a black-white issue. As you know, as I'm sure everyone in this room, as soon as someone feels threatened that they're being called a racist or that they're doing it wrong, automatically the hair goes up in the back of their neck, they shut down, they don't want to really hear what anyone is saying. I'm sure you all in the room know, but to be clear about what implicit bias is, and if you can get this across to everyone, it has nothing to do with racism in general. While race can play a part of it, and it's part of maybe your implicit bias inside of you, that's not necessarily what it's all about. What it comes to is I could have been, when I was 5 years old, pushed down the stairs by a guy wearing red pants. And now I don't think about it, it's just a reaction. I see every guy I see wearing red pants walking down the street, I think is up to no good. I stop, I toss him, I do whatever. So race plays a part in that. However, it just means that there's something in your subconscious that makes you think someone is doing something wrong without any evidence to back that up. It just automatically happens. Really what we need to do is realize that that is happening, and that's the best way to combat it, is say to yourself, do I really have what I'm looking for here, or is it my implicit bias that's driving my actions?
So the biggest difference now with the implicit bias curriculum that we deliver in the state, those master trainers I pointed out and some other folks, is that the NI sites partnered with Center for Policing Equity. And we have a representative here from Center for Policing Equity, if you could just raise your hand, former deputy chief from Salt Lake City, Utah. So we worked with that outfit and we developed a curriculum. They developed a curriculum and we just facilitate that in instruction. And what I really like the way we frame it, and we have framed it, and it's gotten really good reception to the law enforcement community. But I asked Commander, how important is this work surrounding implicit bias? Because we're told, and I believe it, that the biggest impediment to attaining legitimacy, right? So procedural justice is the vehicle to get to that legitimacy. The biggest impediment is implicit bias. Because as a police officer, if you walk up and you have a narrative already in your head, how well is that situation going to go, right? I'm talking both internally and externally. It's truly, in a minute we're going to talk about the 4 pillars here for procedural justice, but it's voice. Voice is the biggest one, right? You have to give someone a voice in that encounter. So what is your experience with implicit bias and why it's so important to address in policing?
Well, I think that, history is there. We can't erase it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I try and explain it this way, that we're all on a journey through life, whether it be through your career in law enforcement or life in general. We all have a vehicle that we're driving, right? And there's a reason why the windshield's larger than the rearview mirror, because you have to keep looking ahead over the horizon at what lies ahead, the opportunities and the challenges. The work that we're doing in procedural justice provide those opportunities. But the nature of the work that we do creates challenges. But we also have to look through that rearview mirror. And that rearview mirror is the history, it is the things that, the challenges we have faced in life, but there are lessons to be learned, so as we move forward, we can engage better with the community.
So for those out there who just heard that for the first time, write that down. Because I heard it last year at the symposium, and I absolutely love that analogy about the front windshield versus the rearview mirror. Lieutenant McCarthy, can you just go over the 4 principles here of procedural justice?
Sure. So basically, procedural justice in general has these 4 principles that you see. The first one being voice. So what does that mean generally? It means that you're actually giving a person an opportunity to talk, to tell you what's going on. The biggest example of voice is we'll get people who come in and complain that they were in an accident and the cops just talked to one driver and they didn't talk to me and get my story, right? They weren't given their voice. People need to be given a voice, and that, again, is externally as well as internally. Neutrality. To me, when I teach this, I talk about that. I think that's probably the hardest one to actually achieve is neutrality. A lot of our departments, you deal with the same people every time. You go on the same call, but I always try to remind people that today's suspect could very well be tomorrow's victim. You have to go with an open mind. You have to always try to remain neutral, and that's the toughest concept for me, for the officers to get, remaining neutral when they're dealing with the same things over and over again. But it's really important. Respect, in general, we all want respect, right? That's no different from whether you're a cop, you're a person on the street, no matter what, everyone's looking for respect. And basically that all gains your trustworthiness. You can get trustworthiness through transparency, And that's something that, as an older generation, we struggle with a little bit sometimes. We had discussed in our agency, putting the policies online for everyone to see, and every one of us in the room said, we don't like it. Why? We don't know. It's our implicit bias, because we were trained that nobody can see what we do, ever, But in the end, we came to the conclusion that, yeah, we have to be transparent. We don't have a good reason not to be, right? So you have to be transparent. Transparency is a huge part of this. So we're putting our policies online, as well as we were meeting with people, going over incidents, talking about things. We have a procedural justice committee made up of outsiders and insiders, and so transparency is an important part. Go ahead. You got more?
No, go ahead.
No, I'm done. You go.
So the last piece, and the one thing with implicit bias is, I came across a saying, and I'll share with you today, and I hope that you write it down. Move from certainty to curiosity. Move from certainty to curiosity. So, and that message is for both the community and the police officers. So for the community, instead of being certain about what a police officer is, who they are, because they are wearing a uniform, they drive a car that's marked, instead of being certain about who they are, move to curiosity, have that conversation. Likewise, police officers, instead of being certain about who that person is standing on the corner with a black hoodie, move to curiosity, have a conversation. And for the administrators in the room, what's really important is for you to develop and create situations where you have non-enforcement contextual situations. The more non-enforcement, non-adversarial situations that you can create where your officers can develop those relationships with the community is going to be successful when it comes to this, this idea and this strategy. Reconciliation, the last piece here for the NI sites and the best practices that they came up with is probably the hardest one to talk about. And you really have to be courageous. And I heard the assistant chief from New Haven this morning in this very room talked about his experience and just bluntly saying, we made a mistake. We have made a mistake in the past, and acknowledging those past harms. There's a difference between acknowledgement and apologies. There may be situations where you have to apologize or it would be appropriate for you to apologize, but I think at the very least, we all have to acknowledge the past harms in the history of policing, and I think Commander Holmes is going to talk about that now.
Well, I think that, historically, as you know, we're a part of the executive branch of government, law enforcement. And so the individuals who are elected to go to Congress or your local state house, whatever, they're charged with setting the rules that we all have to live by. And historically, some rules have been put into place, like Jim Crow, like the Slave Acts, were put into place to hold certain segments of the population down. And who was left to enforce those unjust laws at the time? The police, law enforcement. And so we were the face of, law enforcement was the face of times in this country that were not good. And so historically now we, the ones who are doing the work now, have to recognize those past misgivings and deal with that in our everyday work in terms of internally and also in terms of externally. And there's certainly great examples of that all over to show the history and where we're at now.
Just by a show of hands, out of curiosity, has anyone, not directly involved, but your agency, has anyone been involved with reconciliation in this room? Okay. So, I mean, this is an important piece moving forward. I'm sure you're going to go back to your agencies and maybe have conversations and say, what can we take back? What can we incorporate into our policies, procedures, just a way of conducting business, build our culture? What can we take back? This is one major one. We have some good examples about how this takes place in smaller communities. You saw the NYPD commissioner just reconcile with the LGBTQ community for the incident at Stonewall, right? So it doesn't have to always be race. A lot of times it is, but you can reconcile with the community. My first task as the chief of the Waterville Police Department, I had to go into the city school district and speak to 400 faculty and staff. Well, 4 years ago, and this is embarrassing, but I'm trying to share this so you can take something back with you. 4 years ago, the SRO assigned to the school district raped high school children, had intercourse with female students. So there was a huge break in trust and legitimacy in that community. And just because it happened 4 years ago doesn't mean that it's not prevalent. And, if anyone ever attended or studied the Disney principles, one of them is, it's not my fault, but it's my problem. Guess what? It was my problem. I wasn't there. I came in from the outside. But one of my first duties was speaking to that staff and faculty and the larger school community and apologizing, acknowledging the past harms committed at the hands of law enforcement officers and that agency. And I have another example in a minute that I acknowledged the harms and wasn't part of it, or our agency wasn't part of it. So that's just an example of how you can reconcile. Just one brief example I can provide to you here in the audience. Commander Holmes, do you have any?
Yeah, this is just some of the historical issues that we had to deal with actually in the city of Pittsburgh on 4 of the slides, and then the one is out of Florida. But the far left slide is right where the one of the main streets that go into the city of Pittsburgh called Center Avenue, and it's also the place where we have Freedom Corner, where when Dr. King was assassinated, they burned down most of this neighborhood. But that's after Dr. King was assassinated, with the Pittsburgh police officers marching to the left. Also to the far right, Center Hill District, same thing in the community. The police, Pittsburgh police out there dealing with the aftermath of Dr. King's assassination. In the center there at the top was, this time last year, we had an officer-involved shooting, not in the city of Pittsburgh, a suburb directly outside of the city of Pittsburgh, but all the protests happened in the city of Pittsburgh. And again, officers on the front lines dealing with civil unrest based on police action. And then in the lower right is a Ku Klux Klan rally on the steps of the city-county building in the city of Pittsburgh.
I know a lot of times when we have this discussion, we hear commonly and routinely, what does this have to do with us? This happened so many years ago. We weren't part of it. We weren't even a police officer during the time period. Why does this still come back? Because it's relevant. That's why. We took away some strong experiences when we did the peer exchanges with those 6 NI sites. And I'll never forget, Birmingham, Alabama is one of the 6 sites. And there's a young black officer who was in Stockton with us. And we spent a week together and we shared a lot of stories. And his grandmother could not believe that he joined them. She said, how could you join them? What they did to me, our family, the city, our community, how could you join them? I mean, that's powerful. This is not in the history books. This is very relevant. It's very current. So I challenge you to be courageous and have these conversations with your community. And you have to be genuine about it. You can't just do it because, well, I heard at a symposium that you should be doing this. You really have to find a credible messenger, and you have to be genuine about this message. And I'm telling you, it goes a long way.
So, I'm sorry, Ant. So I was one of those people, right, who sat in the first class that I went to for procedural justice and said, this has nothing to do with me. I wasn't there. My department wasn't there. Not anyone I'm alive with knows any of that. And I took it with Scott, and I actually left that day a little bit angry. A little bit, why are they blaming me for what happened 100 years ago or 50 years ago or 5 minutes ago, but I wasn't there. And as I was driving home, I'm the president of an Emerald Society, which is a fraternal organization for Irish police officers. And I started thinking about some of the officers in the Emerald Society who, when you talk about the Irish potato famine, right, they will get visibly angry and tell you it's not a potato famine, it was the Great Hunger because we were starved to death by the English. We made potatoes, they took them away. And I started thinking about how angry these guys would get who were clearly not alive when that happened, who were clearly not here. So it brought to light for me that these generational effects do happen. These stories are passed down, and they will create actual feelings in people that had nothing to do with them necessarily, but they've been told by their grandparents, by their great-grandparents, by their parents these stories, and it will create a rift that needs to be mended.
So, Commander Holmes, this is a slide here. I know you want to highlight some ideas and thoughts with this slide. Yeah.
You can read it while I'm talking, but I just think, community policing, when we engage in the infancy of your career in law enforcement, you talk about Sir Robert Peel, right? The Peeling Reform and the Rules of 1829. And that's really the foundation of community policing. And throughout the history and the context of law enforcement in the United States, we're on a pendulum, right? We go into the community and then we kind of stray from the community. And things happen and we go back into the community again. And I like to say that things like saturation patrols, not hotspot policing, but zero tolerance policing, those two things where we just dump a bunch of cops in a neighborhood and we tell them to zero tolerance, arrest as you can, and cite as you can, we end up creating negative friction in the community, and it's the total opposite of community policing. Where we look at precision policing, targeting a small percentage of people who actually commit the crimes, and then going back. One of the things that we found out is when we had a SWAT incident, we would go in with a large bear, our SWAT TAC officers, and they'll do what's right and do their thing, and we'd leave. And the community would be wondering, oh, you guys are being militarized, you're taking over, it's the government's, taking over. And we thought to ourselves, well, maybe we should go back a few days later, bring the SWAT team back, bring the bear back, and have a community event. And we started doing that. And so it's those small things like that that really underscore the importance of police-community relations.
So when I first heard that story, I don't know if any other agency in the country is doing that, where they go in, a tactical team will go in, hit a house, and come back a couple of days later to build that trust and legitimacy. So, I mean, there's a clear example, no matter how big your agency is, even if you're part of a county regional team, you can go back with that equipment and build that trust and legitimacy. So this slide also brings up a point about, the saturation patrols, about seeing, you could have an area that's riddled with dots. And we saw some presentations this week, no different, concentrated amount of shootings and shots fired and homicides. But as we know from our good partners from National Network from Safe Communities and all the research that they have done, that it's a very small portion of people committing crimes. It's an even smaller portion of people driving the violence. And it's an even smaller portion of people pulling the trigger. So why would we go and do those tactics, right? That's what we did. That's what I did when I first came on the job as well. And, we got a lot of guns and we drove down the crime, but guess what? The trust and the legitimacy wasn't there. No one trusted us. So what were we really doing and what impact did we have? So one term we talk about is police goggles. I don't know if everyone has ever heard this term, but it's how we in law enforcement view the people in the communities that we serve. So Lieutenant McCarthy, I don't know if you have a minute just to describe that.
Yeah, so one of the things we talk about with police goggles is that it basically comes down to the cynicism that officers feel. I talked about earlier that we keep dealing with the same people over and over again, right? The problem is that those same people that are problematic, the people that Anthony's talking about, the ones that are driving the crime, the ones that are the problems, they become our world. That's how we start seeing everyone. In reality, it's 3 to 6% of the population that are creating crime. Unfortunately, what happens is over time, we get so cynical that we start seeing the 97% as the criminals. We start treating, the guy who has done nothing wrong the same as we treat the person who just killed somebody. It really takes some effort, but we need to educate our officers to take those police goggles off, to see that there's a big world around us. When we give this training, we talk about these numbers and we ask people, what do you think about, how many calls have you been on or seen people and talked to them that didn't fit this 3 to 6%, and how did you treat them? And literally we have guys sometimes argue with us that those numbers are not correct. There's no way. Not in our city. In our city, it's the 96% that are bad and the 3% aren't. So it really takes some effort to kind of drive these things home to people and make them realize that it's a small percentage, and you've now put those police goggles on, and that's all you see.
It is pretty pervasive in our industry. Officers on the street, they truly think that a majority of people don't like them or respect them, and it's not the case. I know for a fact it's not the case, and I would love to get that information out. And how you do that is really by building a culture, creating those environments where the officers are moving from certainty to curiosity. So it's important not to treat that 96% like you treat the people that are driving the violence. We're still going to treat them with respect, but you don't go in there with the tactics that we've talked about.
And one of the ways we combated what Anthony was just talking about was a community survey. We sent out a community survey to see, what does the community actually think of us? How do they feel we're doing out there? How do they feel? Do they feel that we're legitimate? And the nice thing was the numbers came back pretty good. Clearly, there's places we can improve, like anyone else. But we were able then, during this training, to show that to the officers, to show this is the community, this is what they actually think of you, not what you're feeling they're thinking of you because you're dealing with such a small percentage of people.
And that's why the implicit bias training is so important, right? And when I talk about training, I hate to even bring it up in that term because we all assume, we'll just deliver the training and we're all better. It's not the case. It has to be part of the culture, but the implicit bias, that's why the NI, once again, lessons learned, best practices, a lot of money, a lot of research, a lot of funding went into this, and I'm a believer, if you haven't been able to tell already. and passionate about this work. But the implicit bias, if you go into that neighborhood where you're having all the gun violence and you treat everyone like the ones pulling the trigger, you're gonna do nothing but continue those harms in that community. So I think it's important to kind of understand all of these trainings in that term. There are 3 different trainings delivered in that procedural justice. We reframed it recently. Chief Eric Jones from Stockton, California, wrote an article on principal policing. Fell in love with the term. It's vibrant out in California. That's what their state kind of criminal justice services is using. So we brought it back here, and we said people don't understand the term. It's confusing. It's a mouthful. Principal policing kind of encompasses everything we're talking about. So for those executives, those trainers in the room, when you see principal policing, that's what we're talking about now. We kind of rebranded it, but courtesy of Chief Eric Jones and the Stockton Police Department. This here, community bank account, how many by show of hands have heard of this? Okay, so this is great. We can sit here for a moment and talk about it. The one point I want to make about this is that we talk about withdrawals and deposits. Withdrawals occur nationwide. So we turn the TV on tonight and we see someone in, ABC, anywhere. I don't want to pick on any police department in the country. But you see an agency on the news, and it's not a good light. That's a withdrawal. No one sees the patch. So when the officers in my community go out, the only thing that the community is thinking about is what they saw on TV and just kind of reassures their opinions of police officers. So we can't do anything about withdrawals nationally. But what we can do is focus on those deposits locally, and that's where they occur. So Commander Holmes, I know the city of Pittsburgh is doing a tremendous amount when it comes to deposits.
Yeah, so some of our deposits, and we try and look at different ways of going above and beyond just community block watch, coffee with a cop, cookies, cupcakes, and anything that starts with a C with a cop. We try and go a little bit beyond that, and we partnered with the Delta Foundation, which is the LGBTQIA+ organization in Pittsburgh, to do some work with them, and we actually marched in the parade for the first time a few years ago, and we've been marching ever since. We took the lead, or we looked at agencies that took the lead, like New York and Orlando and Miami, some other agencies, and we outfitted one of our cars in the Pride colors. We have that in the parade. And then we also worked with our graffiti. We're a city that suffers, like most cities, with graffiti problems. And we connected with the Andy Warhol Museum, brought in some of our notorious graffiti artists, and had a symposium just trying to think differently and engaging with parts of the community that we normally were not connecting with. And we were blessed to have a good partnership, have 3 professional sports teams. Not doing real good right now, but good partnership with the Steelers, and we started our mounted patrol unit back up 2 years ago, and Marquise Poughkeepsie and Tuitt both donated the funds to buy horses for us, and they also bought a community trailer for us. So just thinking of different ways, and in turn, we also then take youth to each of the Holmes Steeler games with police officers. So this, again, trying to engage. We have how many of you have a Citizens Police Academy? Great way to build ambassadors, right? Citizens Police Academy, Student Police Academy, we now have an Immigrant Police Academy, building ambassadors, making those positive deposits into the bank.
And so I know many of you sit in the room, and whether you're a Steelers fan or not, say, that's great, but you're a city that has, a professional sports team. But I know in the city of Poughkeepsie, you were able to do similar things.
Yeah, so we actually had one of our officers set it up to take a local camp. Took them all to the Renegades game, which is just a local, baseball team. So it doesn't have to be as grandiose. That's what we talked about the small, medium, and large size department. They can do things on a grander scale, but we can have the same impact in different ways with smaller departments.
And I'd say that's where the internal PJ really comes into play. If you empower your officers and they understand it's a clear direction and the culture that you want to build, they're going to come up with these ideas on their own. The police officers, the sergeants, the lieutenants, they're going to come up with ideas on their own. They're going to connect with the community, and they're going to want to, bring them to sports venues. So I know for a fact, in every community here, there's got to be something in close proximity, whether it's a minor league team, that's something that easily can be accomplished. Another part of the outreach is something called listening sessions. And some of these lines will cross each other when it talks about reconciliation, implicit bias, and PJ work. So I don't know if you want to spend a minute. I have a great example, something recently in our community with a listening session, but with the city of Pittsburgh, how do you roll this out?
Yeah, so listening sessions really are just a small group, and they could happen anywhere. We've had commanders and their staffs host them in people's living rooms, church basements. I've done them on corners, and I bring together public works and animal care and control and everybody in city government that deals with public safety. But they could happen anywhere. And really it's just having discussions and listening, because oftentimes when we invite people to the table in law enforcement, we don't listen. And having a voice at the table is important. But then not only that, once you agree on some action items, it's following through with them and then doubling back and having ongoing, continuing listening sessions.
Yeah, so it's a great example. I love the fact that you mentioned it occurred in living rooms and street corners. So, and this is a populated city, one of the biggest cities in the country, and that's how they're doing their listening sessions. So it's not about filling a room like this with 300 people or filling an auditorium and let's have a listening session and let's tell the community how great we are. It really has to happen on those small scale type of one-on-one, and that's how you build that trust and legitimacy. There's two pictures here from the same venue. On the right and then on the left, I don't know if you could see it. I'm in the white chair on the right, and there's two students and then a gentleman to my left. This came about, and I'm trying to build a relationship with the school, right, because of what happened. This came about because the student in the middle plays soccer. He's 14 years old, and he knelt for the national anthem just a few weeks ago. And the school was pretty upset. And there was some discussion about whether they're going to address it in a punitive manner, or they're going to discipline the child. They had a great idea, and something I'm fond of. It's called restorative practices, restorative circles, listening sessions. And they said, hey, we would love to invite you, the police department, into this restorative circle and have a conversation about why he knelt. I said, absolutely, I'm all about it, let's do it. So I take one more step, and I bring an officer with me who was shot overseas. So he was a combat veteran, right, because the issue at hand was the flag, right? Child death for the flag. So I bring the officer there, and we're about an hour into it. And there's 12 minority students, there's some staff, faculty, the mother of the child is there, very strong mother, courageous mother. And I opened up with, they asked me to speak, I acknowledge the past harms. Because you have to listen. When you talk about giving someone a voice, you have to listen. You just don't give them a minute to speak and then not acknowledge what they said. This child said something, he opened this whole listening session up with, why would I stand for a country that doesn't stand for me? Whoa. Now, who am I you talk about fact and opinion like was just mentioned in the luncheon. Who am I to tell that child otherwise? This goes to that point with, you talk about reconciliation. This child wasn't here 50, 60 years ago. But guess what? He's still impacted. That feeling is real. So I acknowledged what he said. I agreed that his feeling was real. I talked about past harms. You could hear a pin drop in this room. No one has ever, and I was told, we've never heard a police officer speak in those terms ever, anywhere, in person, on TV. I'm telling you, the traction that you get if you're genuine, talk about building relationships, those minority students will never look at our police agency the same. And I couldn't have manufactured this, I couldn't have paid for it, and I had no idea. I'm new to the agency. I had no idea other than this was a combat vet that I had brought. He spoke up. After an hour, he listened intently. He spoke up, and he said, I became a police officer because my mother and father were alcoholics. They were drug addicts. My mother beat my father. I went overseas. I became an alcoholic. I was shot. I saw terrible things. I got my life together. And he goes, I became a police officer to protect women like my mother. He goes, and now he starts tearing up. And he says, it breaks my heart when I approach a car of minority, a driver and passengers, and they put their hands up on the roof because they're scared I'm going to shoot them. And he's crying. And you talk about moving from certainty to curiosity? Powerful. The most powerful thing I've ever been part of. I travel the country. I worked with all those 6 agencies, did a lot of work at Stockton. They're on the forefront. That's why they're here. They're going to talk about what they're doing tomorrow. And I became, in that moment, I became a student to a practitioner. And I saw the value in this. And this is, as a small community, I'm a small police department, but the impact that it had with those students and that police officer will never see those minority students the same either. And then the relationship that you have when you walk down the halls or you go to a football game. I mean, so you can, it's simple, but it's hard. And you have to be committed, and you have to build a culture.
You know, one thing you have to think about is, like with this child, perception is reality. I mean, that's a fact. Everyone talks about false narrative in the media and all that. Whether a narrative is true or not, if that's the perception of the public, if that's the perception of the people you're dealing with, that is their reality, and you have to face that. That's how it is. You can't just say, no, it's not like that. What does that do, right? So you have to acknowledge that that's their perception, that's their reality, so you need to acknowledge that.
Yes?
Wow. That's interesting. Thank you.
That's very interesting. And I'm a believer of that comment, absolutely. And that's in that conversation, that listening session, we actually went around and the school psychologist kind of facilitated the discussion. We talked a lot about trauma, the ACEs score and being a trauma-informed school district and police department. So we have about 14 minutes left in the presentation, but I want to allow some time for questions. So give us about 4 more minutes. We want to highlight some initiatives and strategies so you can take back to your communities. This is an example from the city of Poughkeepsie with your committee.
Yeah, so like I touched on it a little earlier, we started what we called, for lack of a better term, because we didn't really know what to call it, Procedural Justice Committee. So we went, actually, like the commander was saying, we grabbed from every different group we could think of. We went to basically their community leaders. So any minorities, and then we got a couple of politicians, a couple of judges, and made this group of maybe, 25 people. And we'll sit down once a month and discuss just this, discuss the history, not only nationally, but what history happened in the city of Poughkeepsie. There are a lot of things that I've been told in that I had no idea went on. They're not passed down. Clearly, as a police department, we're not going to pass down, here's what we did wrong from year to year. So, however, the community knows these stories, and I've learned things through that I would have never known.
Yeah, I mean, and you have to look at practices that you're currently undertaking. When you walk into the lobby of our police station, there's memorabilia, and there's a couple officers killed in the line of duty, but there's a letter written, and I walked by it probably a dozen times. And one of the sergeants, because he knew I was about this work, said to me, did you see what that memo says on it? And it was very distasteful, pertaining to the minority offender. And within a second, we took it down. Because all we're doing is perpetuating that and carrying those past harms by acknowledging that language and keeping it in the lobby is disgusting. So I'm very glad. But this is part of giving a voice to your department and building that culture where you're going to uncover some of these things. So that's a great example. These are just pictures of what Commander Holmes talked about at the Steelers. Was that when they were winning?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. This is the city of Poughkeepsie. And we want to just hit on a couple of these real quick.
Yeah, so we basically do a lot of different stuff. We try to do different things. We work a lot with our PAL and our PBA to do a lot of things for the community. Cocoa with the Cop is something that was started by one of our officers, I don't know now, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. We had a very poor relationship with the school district for years, and this officer took it upon herself to try to mend that, came up with this Cocoa with a Cop. Our officers, at least once a week, are sitting in every elementary school, sitting with the students, having a discussion. We try to, although we want to work with everyone and we want to fix everything, we feel like if we can work with the youth, things will progress as we go on. So we do a lot of things with the youth, hooked on fishing events. We deliver Christmas presents to needy families during Christmas time. We actually partner with the fire department for that, bring the fire truck and Santa Claus and the police come and they hand out presents to kids. So we try to do as much as we can, again, within a limited budget, but we work with partners. We work with the fire department. We work with the PBA, the PAL to make sure that we can do these things.
And there's plenty of private industries out there that want to donate money for these causes. So, that's, once again, being out in your community and developing those relationships. This is pretty interesting, and we'll end here. And I want to talk about just one thing about institutionalizing it in your agency. But as far as community outreach, we'll end on this slide here. But very interesting that I'm sure we'll get a lot of pushback and resistance from law enforcement agencies. If you want to just take a minute.
Yeah, so Dr. Cotty, he's a professor at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. He reached out to me and said, hey, I'm not sure if you heard about the Inside and Out programs. Temple University, they send college students in to take classes with inmates in the state correctional institution in Pennsylvania. And I said I hadn't heard about it, so I Googled it while we were talking. He goes, I want to send police officers into this program. And I said, yeah, that's probably not going to happen. And so we met for coffee and had some more conversations, and he sold me on the idea. But looking at it through the lens of procedural justice, the national initiative, looking at the lens of trying to create guardians in our police officers, because that's what we want is guardians 90% of the time. Then, of course, 10% of the times we're going to need warriors, right? You have an active shooter situation or something like that, you're going to need warriors. But majority of our work is under the auspices of guardianship. And so we started off by sending a small group of officers through this program at the State Correctional Institution in Pittsburgh. And I went there the first day, and I saw the inmates on one side of the room and the officers on the other side of the room, because you take an officer into a correctional institution, they're going in there without their firearm, and some of the people in there they may have put in there. So it was an uncomfortable situation for them, so I got that. Graduation, 8 weeks later, myself and the chief and some others went there, not a dry eye in the room from the inmates and the police officers. And they all got up and gave testimonies of what they learned and how the process worked. And so now, based on officer feedback, now we send all of our police recruits go through this training as part of their police recruit training. So,
I mean, that is a great example of how you build a culture and how you start right from the very beginning developing that guardian mindset. The one thing we didn't get to in the presentation was talking about institutionalizing it in your policies, procedures, and tactics, strategies. The city of Schenectady, I don't know if they're still in the room, they have a great practice. They have body-worn camera, and like many agencies, they have to audit their body-worn cameras, right? So the first-line supervisor will look at it, but they look at it through a PJ lens. Are they giving the civilian in this encounter a voice? Are they treating them with respect? Are they neutral in their decision-making? And in the end, are they trustworthy in the entire situation? So there's a number of things that you can do. The best thing is that a lot of police departments are already doing it. So just have those conversations, lean on people like the city of Pittsburgh, like the city of Poughkeepsie, people that are doing the work, proven, demonstrated successes. So with that, we're at 52 minutes and 29 seconds. So we have about 7 minutes for questions. So I just want to thank you for your attention, and we'll take questions. We can talk, yes?
How do you get officer buy-in at the line level to a program like this? These types of principles, it seems almost like it's a fit.
So that's actually a great question, and that's probably the hardest part. I would say as administrators, you need to look for the right, I think we heard it actually in one of the sessions today, but you need to put the right person in the right place. You need to find the person who, A, is going to be respected by the officers, who is out there, you know, doing the job that they respect, that he's doing an informal leader, if you will. But B, they have to also be a person who themselves is going to buy into this. My chief likes to laugh and say I took the angriest little Irish guy I could find, stuck him in there, the guy who chases people and, you know, drags them off the street and puts them in handcuffs, and sent him to this training, and he bought in, and now I want him to pass that along to our department. So it's really putting the right peg in the right hole, because the wrong instructor could shut the whole thing down.
Yeah, training is a part of it, but I would say definitely from my position leading a police agency, it's really internal procedural justice, right? So I'm treating you the way you want to be treated, and that's what I expect, what I demand of you in the street. I'm not going to treat you any differently. I'm going to give you a voice. I'll be neutral. The process is the most important piece in this. That's respect, right? So it doesn't matter if it's a positive outcome or a negative outcome. So simple terms, car stop, traffic ticket would be a negative outcome. That really doesn't matter. It's how that person was treated. So I think it really top down. Training is a part of it, but building that culture.
and I think also through awards for officers, I think through your promotional process, your hiring process, and your evaluations, whether you do them quarterly or yearly, but having it through the lens of PJ and through the lens of this work is important to also get the buy-in. Don't get me wrong, everyone in the room, it's a process, right? It's a journey, it's not a marathon. And, it took us, I'm from Pittsburgh, FOP was founded there in 1915, so we have a hardcore union environment, but having the right people leading it, chief that believes in it, and then everyone down, and it's starting from the recruits being trained. One of the first classes they take, you will then start to turn that aircraft carrier, change the culture.
Yeah, and you need buy-in from several areas. Clearly, you need the trainer, and as I said, you need it from the command staff, absolutely, because it has to be internal as well as external. But the recruits should be getting it right off the bat. They should that should be automatic. They should get the training. Additionally to that, the FTOs, you should make sure that if you're putting guys in FTO positions, that they're guys who believe in this, who actually practice it. Because, again, right, it's just like deposits and withdrawals. One withdrawal on this, young recruit, and it's over, right? So we need to make as many deposits as we possibly can, internally and externally.
Yes.
So just wanted to illustrate what I saw from this. I was rolling out the climate surveys for the national initiative with the officers and all of the national initiative cities 2 years in a row, beginning of 2017 and then again in the beginning of 2018. And they just started with their courses of training in all of those cities. But in particular, one of the things I saw in Pittsburgh was when we came out in 2017 and I went to every roll call talking to officers and mentioning procedural justice, I got comment after comment, stupid class, the same things that we hear about classes. And you let it roll off and you go on. But the next year when I was out there, I got 0 comments from the officers. Now, that doesn't mean that they all have bought in 100%, but to see that change was real for me. And I saw the same thing in Stockton, I saw the same thing in Birmingham as I went out, and the other 3 APDs as well. So that was a real eye-opener for me.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. It's great that you're here, too. Center for Policing Equity is really behind this, and, we wouldn't be in this position without them, so thank you. Yes?
Patrick Johnson, I'm with the United County Attorney's Office. I appreciate the presentation. I've had the privilege of doing work on race relations for about the past 15 years, and I enjoyed your comments. One of the things that I want to acknowledge that I heard in the last presentation, and I want to emphasize this, I appreciate your presentation, but rarely do I ever hear someone from law enforcement say that we have done some horrific things in the community. I say this carefully to my colleagues, especially as a black man. But the last presentation, a gentleman here by the name of Carl Jacobson from the Behavior Police Department acknowledged, and I want to say that because I think sometimes people think that if we acknowledge that we've done some things, some discriminatory things, that we're going to be targeted. And I'm here to salute that gentleman as a white police officer. God, not to say yay, but to say it takes courage. This way it takes courage, and that's the window of healing between black and white communities and communities of color and law enforcement. That's when the healing takes place. And trust me, I've been doing this work for a long time, and much of the work I've done so well. But part of it is taking ownership, and I say this respectfully, people in power and law enforcement. And the history of law enforcement is largely white and male. And the time that I've heard what he said, I could probably count, I don't know if I could hold up 3 kids. So I want to salute him in front of this college, because that's part of the thing.
Thank you very much. And that's the response that you'll find when you get in these listening sessions and you acknowledge it. They've never heard it before. The community has never heard it. These stories are passed along from generation to generation, and it is part of the healing process. So thank you very much for sharing that. I believe that concludes this presentation. I want to thank everyone for their time and attendance. Thank you.